Hello, and welcome back to another episode 6, I believe, of Farewell Falling Nations. I am your guide through this calamitous world that we are living in, B. the Professor. Let's take a trip through the world, U.S. and abroad, of all the different things that are occurring, from nation states to societies and culture. For those of you that it's your first time here, this is a commentary. This is a dialogue, if you will, from me to you in a way. We're going to ponder things. We're going to ask questions. We're going to see if there's some validity to the concerns that I'm raising here. Are we sleepwalking? Are we just going through the motions? Are we going about our day-to-day without any cognition of the fact that the world is indeed falling? And there are nation states and nefarious actors that are at the forefront of the collapse and the calamity, the impending doom, if you will. We're going to go U.S., we're going to go abroad, we're going to talk about a lot of different things that are pertinent, I think, to you and relevant, unless you just want to continue to be in your sleep pod and act as if none of these things are occurring and they have no relevance to your everyday life. You're more than welcome to do that, and this is probably not the program for you. I would advise you to find something like a cat video to watch, but we're going to get into it. We're going to hop right into all of the nefarious deeds of the world and some of the bad behavior from an integrity standpoint, some things that I find to be very hypocritical, and some things that I think are indicative of people being bamboozled and hoodwinked and led astray by propaganda. Yes, that term, propaganda. It's a very polarizing term. It means a lot of things. It has a lot of complexity within it, but it must be talked about because it is a word in the English language, which means that it's a real thing. It is a real thing. One of my friends, though, I was talking to him. He's in LA. He said, I want you to speak like you speak to me. It's kind of tough, right? Because he's not here, and him and I have, very fruitful conversations and banter back and forth. But I'm going to try to do that because I really do want to come across in a way that shows you that my desire is not to agitate for the simple purpose of agitation. But there's times when I need to stir the pot. I want you to, allow me to do that, because sometimes when you're frustrated and you're challenged, it causes you to reflect and contemplate. And there's other times where, maybe stirring the pot is not the best approach, but having the balance between educating, informing, raising points of reflection, and being a bit more blunt in the way that I communicate is necessary so that we can awaken the mind. That's the biggest thing. Through asking questions, can we awaken the mind? That's the intention. That's the point of this dialogue and this discourse. So without further ado, let's hop into it. We only have a limited amount of time. I have lots of things to do. So do you. So I don't want to waste any of your precious minutes and seconds on this strange planet that we're spinning around in orbit. I want to talk about borders, man-made borders. Arbitrary borders that we create as human beings, saying this is mine and that is yours. Territorial. We tend to be very strange about these things. Also, when people want to cross into our borders from another territory, we have restrictions and we have all kinds of requirements for allowing someone into our domain and our territory. How do we determine who's allowed and who is not allowed? What's the criteria? What is the basis for selection? Because of the Ukraine, or the Russia-Ukraine, should I say U.S.-Ukraine instinctively, I think, because the U.S. puts itself in the middle of everything in the world, because the U.S. has to be the world's babysitter. I don't know why that is, but nonetheless, it is the case. And it has now spilled over into our own borders, which is quite interesting. I think you have a situation happening. Yahoo News reported this. Russians are blocked at the U.S. border, and Ukrainians are being admitted. Funny, isn't it? If you listen to previous episodes, and if you would know that I talked about this, right? This idea of national identity versus individual identity. What is more important? Are we discriminating against people simply because their parents conceived a child in a territory? Or Are we discriminating against people simply because they are ethnically Russian? I think that we are. We want the Russian people to overthrow the authoritarian government, risk their lives to do so, risk the lives of their family. That's our expectation, it seems. Or we want them to completely dissent, okay? Or we want them to defect. And this is our request. Abandon your ethnic origin. You were born in Russia. You are Russian. If your DNA test comes back, it's going to come back Baltic. We want them to completely turn away from that, right? Isn't that what we want? Well, when they do that, how do we respond? I think that we have drank the Kool-Aid of nation states. And these are the kinds of articles that lead me to believe that my premise is correct. Look at what the U.S. is doing. This is pretty bad when you think about it. Russians are blocked at the U.S. border. Ukrainians are admitted. Now, this is happening in Mexico. And there was one individual that was quoted, a Russian individual who he goes by Mark because he wanted to have some anonymity. He didn't want to be identified because he has family still in Russia and he wants them to be safe. But within hours of arriving, the migrant who identified himself only as Mark because he feared for his family's safety in Russia saw 3 Russian migrants admitted to the United States. After 6 hours, U.S. authorities returned his passport and said only Ukrainians were being admitted. Yahoo News reported this. Think about this for a second. Defector does not agree with Putin, wants no part in the war, comes to the nation that is stumping for a support and allegiance of nations coming against Vladimir Putin and what he's doing in the Ukraine. And when a Russian defects and says, I'm with you, I stand, we deny them based off their ethnicity from entry into the United States. Wow. What does quote unquote Mark do now? He left his country of origin. He left his family. He comes to the U.S. that's supposedly a friend and an ally, and he is rejected and denied. So where do we expect him to go then? Does he go back to Russia? If he goes back to Russia, what are our thoughts about him? Do we say that he is complicit? What do we expect him to do? I ask you, U.S. government, what do you expect him to do? Stay in Mexico? Should he become a Mexican citizen now? Ethnic Russian living in Mexico? What should he do? Should he go to Ukraine, fight for the Ukrainians, give his life for a war, die, leaving behind a family? He can't come to the U.S. He can't stay in Russia. He's not Ukrainian. If he goes to England, is he accepted or is he booed? I was watching a contest, a sporting contest, and Russian individual competitors, athletes, were being booed. Individuals, again, individuals that have no ability to determine their ethnic origin. None. I don't recall babies in a hospital at the time of birth being able to decide and determine what their ethnic identity is going to be. Why are we discriminating against people based off of where they were born, the territorial borders in which they were born? This is vile and it's wrong because we're giving people no option. We're giving them no option. What do you expect the Russians to do? Again, those that are not in agreement. This is interesting. This was what quote unquote Mark said. He said Ukrainians and Russians are suffering because of one man, referring to, of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin. He fled shortly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this guy left almost immediately after the invasion started. He tried to come to the U.S. to seek asylum, and he is sleeping at the Mexican border to the U.S. and is being denied entry because he's Russian. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, this is a real thing. I can't believe how this even occurs. It baffles me. I'm at a loss for words because if you are pro-U.S. and you're pro-Western European nation, and your idea of democracy is this idea that no one should be restricting freedoms and authoritarian regimes are negative and they are intrusive And you want people to stand up against authoritarian regimes. And when they do, you don't give them support. Again, the Russian citizens are in a very precarious situation. They're being canceled globally, individuals. They can't leave Russia and go into other countries without being ridiculed and lambasted and rejected and mocked and made fun of. They can't stay in the country because then they're viewed as complicit. They can't try to overthrow the government or protest because they're going to end up in a gulag and starve to death, and then they are now being separated from their families, all because they were born in a nation state that is an authoritarian regime, and because they're ethnically Russian. Picture yourself in that same boat. Imagine the U.S. becomes the world's pariah, and you, simply because you were born in the U.S., can go nowhere in the world. You are rejected by all, simply because your parents conceived you on U.S. soil. Nothing more, nothing less than that. I'd ask ourselves, when you start becoming anti-Russian, ask yourself, are you full of hate yourself? Are you guilty of the same hypocrisy? I think that you have hate in your heart. It looks like to me that the U.S. has hate in their heart. Selective love. That's not real love. It's not real appreciation. That is love based off of allegiance. It's wrong. Individuals are more important than nation states. And my national identity should not put me in a situation to where I'm being rejected by the world simply because I am born of that country. Just because I'm born of a country doesn't mean that I subscribe to all of that country's ideological beliefs. Just because I am within the same ethnic group doesn't mean that I subscribe to all of my ethnic group's cultural identifiers or ways of thinking. I have the right and I reserve the ability to be an individual unto myself. And I very well may have fellow feeling and a sense of camaraderie with those that are within my same ethnic group or nationality, but that doesn't mean that I wholesale have to subscribe to everything. And when I choose to disagree, I should have the ability as an individual to do so and to move about Yahweh's creation with freedom and not be restricted from movement, because human beings do not have any authority to make borders. Who gave man that authority? I ask you that. Who? It's not a divine principle to take arbitrary lines and draw them on a map and say this is mine and that's yours. There are many people groups all across the world. If we start getting to this place to where every time a nation wars against another nation and we are forced to choose sides, we, by that very nature, are participating in discrimination while we try to say that we are inclusive and we want diverse opinions and perspectives. We are excluding people, individuals, because of their national identity, and it's wrong. So won't harp too much on that. I think you should look at this story. Yahoo News published that Russians are blocked at U.S. border. Ukrainians are being admitted. U.S. discrimination. But the U.S. is very good at discriminatory behavior, so that's not new news, right? The U.S. puffs its chest up and acts like it's like this beacon of freedom while it continues to use discriminatory practices across the board. And now it's apparently happening with the Russians and Ukrainians. Let's continue to talk about, some things that are U.S. and I would say Western European nation state related, and also personalities that are speaking out against, right? We know that the Joe Rogans of the world are now considered a pariah because he has a platform larger than propagandists CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, all of these stations that claim to be news networks but are being driven by ad dollars, and they want to have us wholesale believe anything they publish as gospel truth. And you can't at all challenge or perhaps maybe come to the conclusion that what you're reading is misinformation or disinformation and it's being peddled to you as truth. We can't reject it in any way. We have to wholesale accept it. And there are those that are starting to say, you know what, I think that we should maybe look at these things with a higher level of scrutiny. And Russell Brand is one of those people. And most of you now should know who Russell Brand is, and if you don't, you know he was a former Hollywood actor. I don't think that he's doing any feature-length films anymore in Hollywood, but he has found himself to be quite the influence and juggernaut now in the world of news commentary. He's built a subscriber base of over 5 million, and his podcast, Awakening, is very informative. It's very insightful. His dialogue around these topics is very much from an intellectual perspective, and it's a review. It's looking at news from an objective lens, which is what you're supposed to do as a free-thinking, intellectual human. Anyone who just wholesale accepts information that comes to them without having a critical eye, I am very skeptical of your intelligence, to be quite honest. No offense. I'm not trying to be offensive, but if you just read a CNN article, and every CNN article or every MSNBC story that comes out, you're like, oh yeah, that's true. Why? Because somebody on television got on there and read from some lines? You believe it to be true? You don't have any doubt in your mind that perhaps maybe this is not real? Or is it only Russia and China that peddles propaganda? The U.S. could never do that, right? We could never be in a propaganda state. That's just outside of the realm of possibility. There's no way that our government could be colluding with media agencies. There's no way that media agencies have some sort of agenda. There's no way that big business and big pharma could be funding ad campaigns, and therefore these stations would be motivated to speak highly. That couldn't be the case because America is a righteous nation, right? And it's full of integrity. If you believe that, I feel very, very sorry for you because you've been sold a bill of goods. And we do live in a propaganda state. Now, it may be propaganda light. It may be propaganda light. We may have a lesser version of it. Our propaganda is cleaned up, right? It's cleaned up and it's packaged in the form of free speech and democracy. It looks like it. It looks like choice. When in actuality, it's just crafted messaging. And we're starting to see a lot of that revealed. And Russell Brand is taking a critical lens and review of all of these things that are happening. And he's seeing that there's this trail of connection with big business and big tech and big pharma and government agencies and lobbyists that are dictating and controlling the narrative around all of these very, very pertinent topics, from coronavirus to free speech and everywhere in between. And they're trying to smear Russell Brand now. I don't know if you've seen this. Russell Brand is not some like neoconservative. He's not some like right-wing nationalist. First of all, he's British. He's very liberal. It's not like he is a staunch Republican or some sort of parliamentarian who is looking at things from a nationalistic lens. He's actually very open-minded and was, again, a Hollywood actor who is very, liberal, moderate liberal, but he is a free thinker. And now he's being accused of peddling conspiracy theories. Every time you disagree with a government-sponsored narrative, you are now a conspiracy theorist. Do you notice that? Do you notice anytime you challenge something that comes out, you're now labeled a conspiracy theorist? And Google, who is involved in the collusion, they start putting little disclaimers on your videos, and then they attach Wikipedia links as if Wikipedia is some like authoritative source of truth. The audacity of these individuals, right? And we continually sit by and act as if we are not being led astray. I need you to wake up. Russell Brand is trying in a very respectful way. Probably maybe, with a less abrasive way that I am. He's like imploring people to engage in the dialogue and the conversation. And one of the particular outlets, The Independent, among others that are trying to smear Russell Brand and tarnish his reputation, censor his content, flag his content so that it doesn't get distributed to a wider audience because they're upset that he has more cachet now with people than they do. Joe Rogan and Russell Brand are getting more attention than mainstream media and news, and people are not listening to Don Lemon anymore. In all of these shows, Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson and these talking heads that get up there and try to get you to have an emotional response, and they give you no substance. They just want you to pick a side. You can get with this or you can get with that. You can get with this or you can get with that. I think I'll get with this because this is where it's at. Hip hop heads out there, shout out. If you have to choose a side and there is no ability to discuss complexity, that is a problem. If you're choosing a side and you think your side is 100% right, that is an ignorant thing to do. How can you look yourself in the mirror with a straight face and say, yes, everything that my party believes is 100% right. Everything that I see on Fox News is 100% right. Everything I see on CNN or MSNBC is 100% right, 100% right. I agree with it 100% of the time. There's no fallibility there anywhere at all. You are bamboozled. You, unfortunately, are not a free thinker. You are caught in the matrix, man or woman. And I meet people like this all the time. When you have a conversation with them, they're just spitting to you talking points they heard from media outlets. It's really pathetic, actually. Russell Brand is not one of those people. And as a result of that, he's being attacked. In The Independent, the publication that calls themselves The Independent, has a very large ownership stake by the Saudi Arabian state. Think about that for a second. The government of Saudi Arabia owns approximately 30% of The Independent. Russell Brand talked about this, and you can find this, he's got the Luminary Under the Skin. He's got his Awakening video show on YouTube, and you can find this information there. But there was an article that The Guardian came out with, and it said, Saudi state part owns Evening Standard and Independent. This is crazy. Okay, now, this is interesting, too, from the same article. Saudi Arabia has a poor record on press freedom. Go figure, a nation state peddling in propaganda? Wow. They all do this. Goodness gracious, people, please wake up. And the sale of the stake in the Evening Standard's parent company took place in the aftermath of the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, widely considered to have been carried out by Saudi officials. So here you have a murderous regime buying a stake in a Western outlet that a Western journalist was a independent contractor for many different outlets, and he was reporting on things that the Saudi nation state was doing, and they kidnapped him and they chopped his body up. Heathens know no bounds, do they? Nefarious heathens. And these individuals are the leaders of nation states. Their life is going to be required of them one day, and the things they do on the earth will have consequence. You're not exempt. Murderous people will suffer, whether or not you suffer in this life or the next. Retribution is coming for you. If you think that all that there is here, oh man, that is naivety. This is so interesting, right? So all of this was stirred up with Russell Brand because he was talking about the situation with the truckers protesting in Canada. And if you know what Justin Trudeau is doing, he's trying to stop these protests, peaceful protests. And whether you agree with the truckers' protests or not is irrelevant. If you agree with democracy, then you should be fine with them protesting. If you have a problem with them protesting, then you actually don't want a democracy. You are a liar. You have tricked yourself into thinking that you want democracy, because if democratic processes bother you, then you don't want democracy, period. And the truckers are protesting, and they're messing up supply chains. Justin Trudeau is trying to change Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. He's trying to stop these protests, and he is trying to use these things to restrict liberties that have broader reaching impacts and effect on our ability to claim to be democracies. Russell Brand, he points this out, and as a result is being accused of peddling conspiracy theories and being right-wing, when we obviously know that he's not. Russell Brand is nowhere near right-wing. And this is one of the things that he said on his podcast. He said, the mainstream media is not your friend. The culture is not your friend. The government is not your friend. Big business is not your friend. They are operating collegiately in unison to create a set of systems that are beneficial to them and disadvantage you. The biggest threat to their power comes from unionization and mobilization of large groups of people. They are so nervous about it. They are so aggressive about it. They are so protective about it. It makes me think they've got an agenda. And this is the thing. Makes me think we should be free-thinking individuals. Russell Brand is choosing to be a free-thinking person, and explore and look into these things and not just take information that's published on a news site and say, oh, this must be true because it came across my news feed and it's written by a publication. And I trust this publication because they simply are a publication. The mainstream media is not your friend. This is what I've been saying here. The culture is not your friend. The government is not your friend. Big business is not your friend. And they are operating in unison. And they are creating a set of systems that are beneficial to them, and they disadvantage you. And anytime they feel a threat to any dissenting opinion about these things, they try to cancel and cut off and throttle and eliminate. And like he said, you have to play whack-a-mole to anyone who challenges these ideas. Stamp them out as much as you can. Make them pariahs. Label them. Identify them as right-wing or nut jobs or conspiracy theorists. And this is the start of a fallen nation state. The Western world is falling. It's collapsing. And although it fights against authoritarian regimes, they themselves are trying to become authoritarian. You see what Trudeau is doing in Canada. You see what's happening here in America with more and more fake news and propaganda across the board. I saw on TikTok the other day, there was a video of a reporter showing body bags lined out in Ukraine. It was staged. One of the corpses came alive, y'all. Y'all have to go on TikTok and find this. It's hilarious. One of the corpses came alive. Well, obviously, no one resurrected, literally. But the wind blew off one of the body bags or one of the tarps they had over, and the person that was laying underneath was trying to pull it back on him. This was a report that was coming out of Ukraine. How can you know what information is true and what is not? They're using video game footage in some of this stuff. They're using old Crimea footage in some of the stuff. They're using video from other types of conflicts around the world that are not even taking place in Ukraine. Then you've got them showing these bodies lined up, and they're not even real bodies. There's actors underneath them playing dead. This is the Western media. We're not talking about Russian media. But all the while, every time I turn on TV, all of the media is focused on trying to get information into Russia because Russia has blocked Western media and they're running propaganda campaigns. Well, what is happening here? They're both running propaganda campaigns. Governments are not your friend. They have their own interests and they use you and they prop themselves up to be champions. If you look at all these people, Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau and Macron from France, Emmanuel Macron, these are elitists. They're being groomed for these positions. They want the appearance of democracies. These are faux democracies. They're not real. Wake up. This is why this podcast is called Farewell Falling Nations. And before I go on to the next story, I should probably remind you to support. Please do support. Be a donor. I would love that because then I could do more things like video. I do want to do some video. That'd be great, but I can't justify it right now at this point in time until I can get some more contributions to the podcast. I would support Russell Brand. I think you should. I think you should definitely support Russell Brand. I think you should be aware of the propaganda machine and the mainstream media, these outlets that are owned by nation states in America with our propaganda light, these networks that are being funded by big business and big pharma, large ad campaigns, donors, lobbyists. This is definitely real. Anytime you see news stories and they start looking like press releases, that's a problem. And I'm seeing that, especially around coronavirus. They don't want you to really know anything truthful about coronavirus. They want that under wraps. Anything that doesn't fit the narrative, they stamp it out and they say, well, don't listen to any other source other than what we give you. As if the World Health Organization is like this beacon of truth and righteousness and transparency. Yes, they've just done a great job. Look at how many things they've fumbled throughout the years across the world. I'll let you go do the research on yourself. And I'm supposed to just trust them wholesale, blanketly, right? Because these are divine entities. These are people that don't have the capacity to lie and deceive. Really, I'm supposed to believe that, right? You want me to believe that I'm just supposed to trust Anthony Fauci wholesale. Everything he says is true. Every single word that comes out of his mouth is gospel. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to question things. And if I do question things, I shouldn't be looked at with a side eye just because you have chosen to put your faith in flawed individuals who have ill motive and ill intention and who are amassing all kinds of wealth and ill-gotten gain. We seize oligarchs' yachts, which is strange. Like, why weren't you seizing yachts before this happened? If those yachts were acquired nefariously or through ill-gotten gain, why weren't they seized before? Why are you seizing their yachts now? You didn't have a problem with the yachts before. You didn't have a problem with Ibrahimovic owning Chelsea before, but now it's a problem. Get out of here, man. Y'all are hypocrites. Shut up. I'm tired of it. I don't even want to talk about this anymore. I want to talk about something else, though. I want to talk about the world power shifting. I've said this before on this show. Those of you who have listened, the balance of power in the world is shifting. I've been saying this actually for years in my circles of influence and people that will listen to me, that the Western European nations are falling. Nation states rise and fall, and national and world powers have a cyclical type of turnover, right? There is a life cycle to nation states, and to life cycle to empires. It's typically around 250 years on average. The U.S. is at the cusp of that, and you see the influence waning. I think that's why Vladimir Putin is testing it. Xi Jinping is testing it. You look at China's Belt and Road Initiative, you see there's an ambition. And it's easy to do that because for all of the criticism that you can levy against China and Russia, they don't have the level of turnover that we have. In America, we can't agree on anything. Every 4 years there's a new guy in there. And then the first 2 years of his presidency, he's turning over the last things the last guy implemented. So you implement things that you want, and then the next guy comes and he turns it over. It's ridiculous. That's how divided we are. I'm surprised there hasn't been civil war. I think we're on the cusp of it. America, is going to cease to exist as we know it, I believe. It can't sustain like this because you people can't agree on anything. You can't even have a conversation without getting mad. You can't control your emotions. You have no self-control. And people who are more inclined to camaraderie and oneness, even if that oneness is somewhat forced, are going to advance faster along. And China is one of them. And I read this article. This came from Quartz, which is a financial publication, right? So they don't have necessarily, from what I know, any type of political agenda. They're simply reporting things from a financial standpoint. I found it to be very interesting what they said. They said China seeks to overtake the U.S. And this is real. Why it matters if Saudi Arabia sells oil in Chinese yuan instead of U.S. dollars. Did you guys know that oil is exchanged in U.S. dollars? This happened a long time ago. This gave us our currency kind of liquidity. This article is very interesting. If you read it, and I'm going to read it because there's a lot of financial complexity within it, so we kind of need to break it down a little bit. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about this. But this article was by Samanth Subramanian. I think I got your name right. It was published, I think, like a couple weeks ago now, by the time you hear this. Not for the first time, China is attempting to buy oil in yuan rather than dollars. And now it may have found a willing seller. They don't want to use USD. They want to use the yuan. Saudi Arabia, which sells a quarter of its exports to China, is considering making these sales in yuan, the Wall Street Journal reported. These negotiations, which have surged and ebbed over the last half-decade, are not likely to fructify soon. For one, Saudi Arabia pegs its rial to the dollar, so any damage inadvertently dealt to the dollar will hurt its own currency. But the U.S. geopolitical hegemony is based so significantly on the petrodollar, with 80% of global oil transactions denominated in dollars, that the question is ever present: what would the world look like if the petro yuan became the oil industry's currency of choice? There's a lot of implications to this. So oil, fossil fuels, obviously, you even see within this Ukraine-Russia conflict, it's a hot button item. Our gas prices in the U.S. have skyrocketed, and we don't even get very much oil from Russia, like somewhere around like 10, 15%, and it's hurting our pockets. The gold standard used to be that where the oil producing nations, OPEC, used, but they were able to be convinced to use USD, which then now everyone has to buy oil in USD, which spreads the USD currency across the world, and people are having to exchange in US dollars, which makes our dollar and our currency strong around the world, which makes our geopolitical position one of strength. And this happened back in like the 80s, okay? Our economic dominance was built on petrodollar. The dollar's robust status as a reserve currency owes much to the strength of the U.S. economy, but it also derives from the dollar's ample liquidity, which is partially a result of countries maintaining pools of dollar reserve to buy oil. Wow, clever U.S., are we not? The world depends on oil. Tie oil to the dollar. The world depends on the dollar. You can't buy oil in your home country's currency. You have to use dollar, which means I have to have huge amounts of US dollar on hand because I'm having to constantly buy oil to keep my country running. Man, that's clever. But not advantageous for other nation states. Great for the US, very bad for other nation states because it makes them dependent on the United States. And if the U.S. sanctions you or cuts you off from the global economy, well, then what do you do then? You're somewhat screwed because you got all this currency that you can't exchange. China doesn't like that, and they shouldn't. No nation state should want to be at the behest of another. I wouldn't want to be controlled, especially as a Chinese nation state, by European countries. The audacity for you to control my future and dictate how I spend my money and make me use your currency for things that I need. And they're trying to convince Saudi Arabia to abandon this relationship, which they should. That link was forged in the early 1970s, not long after President Richard Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold. In 1974, Washington and Riyadh struck a deal by which Saudi Arabia could buy U.S. Treasury bills before they were auctioned. Nation states and their nefarious deeds. In return, Saudi Arabia would sell its oil in dollars, not only enlarging the currency's liquidity, but also using the dollar to buy U.S. debt and products. The political economist David Spiro, in his book, The Hidden Hand of American Hegemony, described how Saudi Arabia convinced other OPEC nations to invoice oil in dollars rather than in a basket of different currencies. Consolidate power. That is the U.S. way. We do it here with big companies gobbling up smaller ones, consolidation of power. If the yuan displaces the dollar to a sufficient degree in the annual $14 trillion global oil trade, although what the sufficient degree would be is difficult to say, countries will have to maintain yuan reserve instead. Man, that's crazy. At the moment, 2.48% of the world's reserves are held in yuan, compared to 55% for the dollar, according to IMF data. Oil producers receiving yuan would have to spend it on Chinese debt and imports, further strengthening China's economy. But if the world was particularly awash in yuan, other trade might start to be yuan dominated, metals or soybeans. So think about this. China is trying to shift the balance of power in the world. They're already encroaching themselves on Taiwan. They want European influence off of their continent, as they should. Because I don't see Chinese influence on the European continent. I don't see that. It seems like European nations are the only ones that can go around the world and put their influence and their culture on everyone else's continents and then act as if that's the right thing to do. When countries want the European influence and cultural influence away from their countries, then we act appalled like, oh, well, you're restricting democracy. No, they don't want Western European culture and Western European influence and power in their own country. That's a legitimate desire. Now, I don't want China to take over either. It's not like they're any better. I mean, you heard the episode that I talked about them perverting the Bible and making a fake Jesus. They're up to no good as well. The effect on both China and the U.S. would be profound. To preserve the yuan's new role, China would have to ensure political stability and financial transparency of the kind the U.S. promised in the 20th century. The U.S.'s abilities to issue dollar debt and earn dollars for exports would decline, so its economy would shrink. In this situation, the dollar's weakening may trigger a vicious cycle. Capital flight away from the dollar and towards the yuan, debilitating the dollar further. Those events, experts say, are unlikely to transpire. Unlikely, but could. Analyzing these contingencies, though, is a useful reminder of how much of our modern moment, from the success of sanctions to the progress of green energy, is predicated on the strength of the US dollar. The balance of power is shifting, people. These are just growth pains, birth pains of the beginning. The US can't fight a war in Europe. We just failed in Afghanistan. Can't continue to take over people's nation states and try to influence them. China has cut America out, especially socially, which they should, because America's culture is bankrupt. And China has every right to say we don't want American influence in our country. I think that this is fitting because when you prop yourself up as a self-righteous nation state and you try to go around gallivanting as the moral standard, but yet you yourself have been uncovered as doing things unethical and immoral and being involved in propaganda and being involved in all sorts of espionage and overthrowing governments and going into countries to take them over under false pretense, you can't expect the world to continue to respect you. And eventually, someone is going to rise up against you. And that's what's happening. So as we kind of reflect on all these things, right, from the border discrimination, you see all these geopolitical issues, you see the suppression of information and intellectual dialogue and discourse, the inability to reject false narratives and information that comes to us that we know is not quite true and accurate, fake media reports, fake news stations that are bought by Saudi Arabian states and other government states, by big tech, big pharma. We as individuals have to rise up. We have to resist. We have to resist. I'll say it again. You have to resist. You can't just go back to work and act like nothing's going to happen. What are you going to do when your job is gone? You can't feed your kids. Hyperinflation occurs. Do you think that in the U.S. we are so far away from Venezuela? You think they were that far away? What if the U.S. dollar loses its strength? Price of goods goes up. The quality of goods goes down. Hard to drive anywhere. You can't get a job. The profit margins of these companies, because they're pocketing it, is so slim. You saw that with the quote-unquote pandemic. It only took 30 days for the U.S. economy to crash. We're fat on debt. This is not good. This is not good. Please don't just go back to your house today at the end of the day and do nothing. Contemplate, reflect, and identify what you can do as an individual citizen to resist. Sometimes just even join the conversation in the dialogue. Comment in this section. Make your thoughts and opinions be known. Like, share, subscribe. Show that there are alternative ways of receiving information and knowledge, and that you are a willing participant, that you are not some sort of conspiracy theorist. You are just a regular, everyday, average citizen that wants truth, and you want light brought to darkness, and that we can no longer allow the world as it stands to just spiral out of control, that wicked men must be held accountable. We have to dissent. We have to resist. To end, I just want to talk about one positive story real quick, as I like to do, to end it so we live on a positive note, because there are individual citizens that have good inside of them. And this one is about an NBA basketball player. He donated his full salary for this season to help a hospital in the Democratic Republic of Congo to honor his father. Bismack Biyombo returned to the NBA after a year as a free agent, has announced he will donate his entire $1.3 million salary to the construction of a hospital in his hometown in Congo. He took last season off to attend to his sick father who passed away in August of last year, 2021. He became aware of just how fortunate he was simply to be able to bring his father to the hospital. He made this announcement a couple Fridays ago, a few months after he signed his one-year contract with the Suns. The construction will be carried out through his foundation, which used the star's success as an NBA player to help those in the DRC. During the alert pandemic, the foundation delivered $1 million in medical supplies to hospitals across the country. The foundation focuses on creating initiatives in 3 areas to multiply opportunities for children in the DRC: athletics, education, and health. Its work results in 185 annually granted scholarships, 150 higher education opportunities, and helps over 1,000 patients every week receive treatment at Congolese hospitals. This is phenomenal, guys. You should support it. Bismack Biyombo Foundation. Look that up. There are people that still have a desire, despite the wickedness and the heathens that run the DRC, that prostitute and pimp their own people. There are men like Bismack Biyombo who are deciding to give back and add value and not be leeches, parasites who take and suck. They contribute positively to society and culture. And ask yourself, what can you do in your own world? We all have our own kind of orbits that we rotate in. What can you do to add value? Where can you be a positive impact? Where can you be a positive influence? How can you contribute to help those around you, uplift, inspire, motivate them, speak truth in places where there's darkness and lies and deception? What little can you do? Don't just go back to your day-to-day and act like you don't see these things. You will have to give account for the time that you spent here on this very strange planet. Know that to be true. Whether that accountability comes here or when you pass and your soul ascends, all that you've done here is recorded and it's real. Be present, be here, search yourself, stay awake, and let's not let nation states and societies take us down this path of spiraling into utter chaos. I'm B. the Professor. This is Farewell Falling Nations, and I'm out.